Hello and welcome to this sort of off-the-cuff episode. I basically decided that I wanted to talk about this because I was watching it earlier and I thought you might be interested. Now, what this is J. Dyer's tag argument, or the transcendental argument for God. It's sort of like a kind of presuppositional argument, but it's a bit different, and the theological niches that Jay runs in are very different to the likes of other presuppositionalists. I mean, firstly, he's Eastern Orthodox. He's got a huge following on YouTube, huge Discord with a lot of relatively insecure young men in there. I've been in there a few times, adding one to the number of insecure young men in the Discord. And a while ago, he spoke to Alex Malpass in a debate, and it's really, really good. I think Malpass really brought out how much of a sort of non-argument it is. So yeah, that's what we're going to be looking at today. So just playing through that, I'm going to be providing some commentary on that. If you're just here to hate, then you can go and watch that debate without my commentary if you want. And if you enjoy my commentary, then you can stick around. Maybe one thing that it might be worth reading through beforehand is Alex actually wrote a blog post about it. So I don't know if, in terms of setting the scene, it would be worth just giving that a read. I don't know how many people that will turn off, though. But maybe let's just give it a go anyway. So sorry for the infinite loop there. So yeah, this is Alex's blog, Use of Reason. And he's got some cool posts on here as well, like one on T-Jump's moral theory, on Dawkins' argument, Stefan Molyneux stuff, Andrew Loki, who's sort of becoming more and more popular at the moment. So those of you who sort of run in these circles, you might find it interesting to go on there and give some things a read. But anyway, we're just going to have a quick read through this. Where am I? Just making sure you can read that okay on the screen. So a transcendental argument for the law of non-contradiction, part 1. Recently, I debated J. Dyer on the Non Sequitur Show. Here's a link to the debate. That's that tab. Dyer's a presuppositionalist YouTuber and blogger. His channel's called Jay's Analysis. Now, he is one bizarre sort of figure. He's really into like conspiracy theories, kind of like Pizzagate. I guess it's sort of like, do you remember how those of you who were around for like when I watched Jonathan Peugeot and his sort of bizarre conspiratorial Jordan Peterson thinking? This guy probably thinks Jordan Peterson's like an alien lizard or something, but it's very similar weird sort of view of the world. From where I'm standing, at least, where everyone's sort of in a pedophile ring or whatever. I've just been banned from YouTube. Oh yeah, and he has a book called Esoteric Hollywood: Sex Cults in Film. I have no idea, like just looking through the chapters. Yeah, Babylon and Kubrick, Spielberg's Android Brothers. Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I've obviously watched the Stanley Kubrick film, and it does have sex cults in it, but that's what the film's about. I guess there are conspiracy theories, so that's what it's about. Anyway, not here to comment on any of that today. So Alex says, our debate was about Dyer's version of the transcendental argument for the existence of God. Tag. Dyer didn't present the argument in premise, conclusion, form as such, and that limited the amount I could critique it. I hope to have a second round with Dyer, who I think was also keen to speak more about the topic. It felt like we scratched the surface of the issue. We discussed the problem of induction, and I explained my argument outlined here. We touched on the argument of divine conceptualism, and I explained my argument outlined here and here. He had replies, but we didn't really get very far. I think that's incredibly charitable of Alex as an interpretation of how things went, and very optimistic. I don't know, obviously, what happened with regard to them speaking again. Quite a large section of the debate was about a claim Dyer made, which was that Aristotle made a transcendental argument for the law of non-contradiction. I want to say a few things about this here to spell out more thoroughly what I was saying at that point in our discussion. For me, it was the most interesting bit. This part is 1 or 2. So I guess, I mean, this article is going to focus mostly on that. Whereas I think, I don't know, I think we should probably get into the debate then. But that blog post is there for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess I'll just get into playing the video. I hope I shared my audio. Let me just re-share the screen. Hopefully you can see it and you'll be able to hear it and everything like that.
Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. It is Wednesday, right? I got that right.
Yeah, all day long. And okay, well, good. Here, I don't know about other places.
Good. I hope you with us. So if you have a gripe with Shannon or I, or about his, he's going on a 3-city tour, and he's raising some funds for that to spread libertarianism. So we're going to be talking to him about what's going on with that and why a third party is a better choice this election and this coming up election.
I wanted to do like broadcast my study, so I'm not using a green screen now. So this is actually my reading list that I've done, if anybody believes that. So only because I didn't want to be outmatched by Dr. Malpass here. So anyways, yeah, we're going to be talking about that. I guess that you guys are going to be a session on the tag argument. We have Dr. Alex Malpass with us, who's a contemporary philosopher, logistician. I know where you're from. I know what school you're from, but I don't know if you want me to say. Do you want to like introduce yourself or what school you're at, or you were at?
I don't think that's necessary, really. I mean,
okay. Just anything that you want to tell them about yourself, then, because I don't want to like give too much away about you.
I don't know. I have a PhD in philosophy. I've been interested in transcendental arguments, in tag, I guess. I don't know. I don't really think anything else is that necessary, to be honest.
Okay. You want to promote your blog?
I guess. I mean, I don't care about any of that shit.
Okay, no problem. No worries. Okay.
I mean,
that's fine. And we got Jay Dyer back with us. He was actually with us before.
I have I mean, I doubt Alex will watch this, but Alex, that's got to be the most awkward introduction.
We were having a conversation. I believe it was on like I don't want to say Satanism, but I guess numerology in Hollywood.
Well, it was my book. So there was we had a debate about the content of my book. So it was a great chat. I had a good time with Mr. Atheist.
Esoteric Hollywood, is that what it was?
Yeah, that was right. That was my first book. Yeah.
Awesome. So we're going to kind of turn over to you guys because I don't know where in the directions you want to go for the tag. So we're going to let you guys just do a free form.
Can I mention my background?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so basically, I do Esoteric Hollywood. Book-wise, my TV show is Hollywood Decoded, which you can watch on Gaia TV network. It's also on Amazon Prime. And I do a lot of philosophy and film. My graduate work was in analytical philosophy, so I do have some familiar.
I genuinely don't know that this is true. Like, this might, I guess maybe I should be more responsible because I'm publicly putting this out there. But I'm actually not sure if he has a postgraduate degree in philosophy. He might have an undergraduate one. I don't know. I've heard things, rumors around.
With the topics that I think Dr. Malpass is going to want to discuss. And I've been a proponent of transcendental arguments for about 20 years. So it was something I put a lot of time into in my grad work. So my website is Jay's Analysis, and it kind of covers everything from geopolitics to conspiracy to Hollywoods to philosophy and theology.
Awesome. Well, this is going to be like really interesting. I know a lot of people have been kind of like wanting this kind of discussion. I know a lot of people in the live chat, I can see their names now. They're going to be listening with great intent. So I hope this actually goes very well. I'm not, like I said, I'm not specific sure what your argument's going to be, but it's going to be kind of a free form. We just ask you don't talk over each other, because if you do, it's going to be bad for the outside chat. Plus, I've noticed with Dr. Malpass, he's had a little bit of a lag, so just bear with it because you may not have actually stopped his argument, and I don't want there to be kind of any overlap. Okay. So, but Jay, do you want to like start us off, and then we kind of go from there?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll try to keep it as concise and clear as possible. So what I believe is that philosophy essentially is a paradigm system, and everybody has a philosophy. We all have a paradigm of beliefs. And I agree with kind of the traditional classification that a worldview is ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. And when we look at each of those branches of philosophy, we all, I believe, have presuppositions or assumptions. And so if we look back to Aristotle was one of the first people to propose a transcendental argument in his metaphysics. And he gave this as a form of argument, that's kind of a meta argument for justifying the laws of logic themselves. Now, this has a long history in philosophy.
So just so far, what are we like 10 seconds in, right? We've had a lot of stuff thrown out there for like 10 seconds. So all worldviews have presuppositions. Ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology are what make up a worldview. I mean, like, arguably, those things are all up for debate, right? So those are contentious, just the first few statements that have been said.
Different types of usages of transcendental arguments. And it's really from the time of, say, 8th century church fathers like John of Damascus that we have really precise attempts to use it for the existence of God. So that has an unknown history in Western theology, where you get more of the Thomistic school. So I'm not a proponent of any of the Thomistic arguments or that school of philosophy or theology. I'm an Orthodox Christian, so Orthodox theology is very distinct from Thomism. So if you fast forward up into the modern era, the usage of transcendental arguments for God is more clear in the modern period because of the trek that philosophy took in the West, where you have a lot of questioning of paradigms, questioning of language after, for example, Giambattista Vico, you get the questioning of linguistic philosophy. And then by the time of the Enlightenment with Hume, you get a radical skepticism. So the reason that Kant and Hume are important for the transcendental argument is not so much their philosophy as a whole, but rather the questions that they raise. So you'll hear a lot of times people who promote the transcendental argument who are schooled in this, they'll talk a lot about Hume. And that's not because we're Humean, but rather because we see Hume taking the kind of atheistic skeptical route to its more logical conclusions and ultimately saying that there's not really a justification, logically speaking, for induction. And if you follow the history of logical positivism, of naive empiricism, psychologism through the history of Western philosophy up to the modern times, you get basically William Van Orman Quine in Two Dogmas of Empiricism reaffirming and restating the central arguments of Hume that induction still doesn't have a rational justification. So that's just kind of a brief history of transcendental arguments, and they've entered into a more precise Christian apologetic, obviously, in the last century. But we see that as a reaction to the fact that philosophy became, after the Enlightenment, much more focused on post.
So far, I mean, maybe this is one way to introduce his argument, but so far, he's not really told us what the argument is, at least in my book. But he has given us like an excursus of like a bunch of history of philosophy stuff. I mean, and then his sort of interpretation on some of that is potentially questionable.
Modernism, it became much more radical, and it started questioning presuppositions. And so transcendental arguments are essentially a response to those questionings of presuppositions, giving a different form of argument than a classical non-paradigmatic type of argument, you might say. So when questions get down to the level of basic paradigms, we believe, this is one distinctive that we want to be clear about, that arguments are ultimately circular. And so
Okay, so now he said something else. When questions get down to the level of basic paradigms, arguments are basically circular. Now, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, like, I've got a vague sort of impression that it could make sense. Like, oh, the most fundamental things, it's going to be difficult to question the most fundamental things because you're going to be using them, you know, like during your questioning or something like that. Maybe I'm gonna really try hard to be nice and charitable.
I wouldn't say that they're a fallacy. I do believe, obviously, circular arguments are a fallacy, but at the level of kind of paradigm questions, we would argue that circularity is unavoidable. So the crux of it then is how the way that we get to God from all this is that basically, I would say the argument that I would make, and I can't speak for, I'm not here to speak for Matt Slick or Dark Dawkins or any of those other people. I'm here to make the argument that I'm making, which is specifically that there's a whole host of transcendental types of things, preconditions for knowledge, preconditions for the possibility of metaphysics, preconditions for the possibility of ethics. And if we look at a lot of these different transcendentals, what we are left with is kind of a placeholder, and it's fine to talk about a placeholder given the type of being that we describe God as, namely that he's omniscient, omnipotent, he's invisible, right? He's not visibly seen, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to follow, I would argue, that the way that we would argue for that kind of a being is not the same way that we would argue for typical kinds of things like, does water boil at 100 degrees? Does gravity function in this way? So because God is a...
Okay, so now he's made the claim that the way that we would argue for God is different from the way that we would argue for other things. I'm not really sure that I think that that's right. I mean, like, it sort of seems to me like the tools of reasoning, right, that I have are going to have to be the same for like any type of conclusion. There's not like different reasoning or something. Yeah.
Unique kind of being, the type of argument that we're going to make for that kind of a God is more akin to something like how we would justify the laws of logic themselves, or mathematical objects or entities, things that are more abstract or conceptual in nature. And since God is more like that, I'm not saying he is equated to laws of logic or that he is equated to numbers or number theory, but I'm saying that because he is more like that kind of a thing than just...
Yeah, so a posteriori, I'm taking it on good faith that you're right. So if X is a necessary condition for Y, then given that Y is the case, then X basically, oh, you can't even see because my X, Y. So maybe if that's the form of transcendental argument, it's fair enough, right? But I mean, I don't think Jay's made any kind of claim like that so far. He said the type of argument is going to have to be different, but he hasn't actually said why God is a necessary precondition for any of those things. Like, why should we think that that's true?
A phenomenal sense experience object, the kind of argument that we would do would be more of a transcendental type of argument. So basically the argument is just simply that when we look at the fact that the way that we justify the existence of the self is as a transcendental category, I believe the way that we justify the existence of the laws of logic, mathematical objects and entities, meaningful statements and sentences is through transcendental presuppositions. The way that we justify the existence of time and spatial relations is through transcendental presuppositions. The way that we justify the existence of the external world in philosophy would be through a transcendental presupposition. All of those things are transcendentals, and I would say that when we add all these up, we have this ball of transcendental categories. The way that we would justify this big ball would be the fact that the Christian God actually does provide an excellent basis for that. And so we see then coherence from our perspective, right? Not saying that every single question is answered. I don't think any worldview can do that. But what we at least see is coherence in this system. And I would argue that the other systems that say presuppose materialism or presuppose radical...
I don't think he's really made any claims for us to see how it, like what kind of beliefs are bumping up against each other to be coherent or incoherent together.
Empiricism, psychologism, naive empiricism, positivism, those systems at a very fundamental level completely contradict and don't even...
And then he's just sort of said, he's just said all of these other views are contradictory.
Allow the possibility of logic, ethics, etc. So when we compare the two paradigms, that's how the argument is actually made, is that it's a paradigmatic level comparison of systems.
Okay, thanks for that. So there was a lot that you said there, so I'm just trying to pick what the right place to start this is. Given the way you described it, it sounds to me like an inference to the best explanation argument. So you're saying, take the explanation that my, let's say, worldview provides for various things like laws of logic, morality, I don't know, knowledge, induction, whatever. Pick a bunch of things that need explaining, and what you're saying is that you've got a candidate explanation for all of those things, and that if we compare that to other candidate explanations, you think your position it has. I mean, I'm not quite sure how we'd make the determination. What you think the mechanics are of the determination? I mean, is it that yours has a better overall balance between ontological commitments on the one hand, costs of the theory weighing up against theoretical virtues like explanatory power, simplicity, lack of ad hocness, that type of thing. So it sounds to me like it's an argument of explanation that you're offering. Does that seem right to you?
Well, typically, again, for example, maybe the best way to answer this question would be, I did listen to the debate or the discussion that you had with, I think his name was Darth Dawkins, and I'm not advocating Darth Dawkins, but what I'm saying is that what I noticed from your responses in that 2-hour discussion was that I think that you were thinking about things at the level of, say, just normative logical discourse. But what I'm saying is that I think that the arguments I'm making are much broader, they're much bigger, because I'm making an argument from a more extreme paradigmatic level. So rather than it just being
I genuinely don't think he's really said anything contentful there. He's just saying, like, this is different. It actually could this be like a paradigmatic case of special pleading? I don't know. I suppose if he actually provided some sort of argument that those were the necessary preconditions, you know, for us to be able to, if he actually offered some kind of argument and showed how we actually had to use the things that he's describing in order to even have this discussion or whatever, then maybe it wouldn't be special pleading. But I don't think he's really doing that.
in debate about a specific, say, law of logic. Like, well, how do we know if modus ponens is true? How do we know if the law of identity is true? It's actually a more broad speaking mega argument, and it's going even further, and it's saying not only does Christianity provide an explanation, but that it actually does provide coherence. And so in terms of specific truth theories, I'm not advocating everything in terms of modern coherence theory, but it's more like that kind of a worldview, a coherence theory of truth for epistemic justification, etc.
I mean, he's saying it's more like a coherence theory, so he's not saying it is a coherence theory. But I find it interesting that that's like the anti-realist theory of truth, right? That's the idealist position. I don't know, maybe, but it seems like Jay wants to avoid a kind of anti-realism and say, well, actually, he's got something outside of the system which reaches in and gives him, I don't know.
Than it is the classical foundationalist model of justifying claims on the basis of, say, self-evident maxims. Like we would not say there's any self-evident maxims. So if you adopt the position, and I think you have to ultimately, that worldviews at the fundamental level are circular, then even if we were to take where I think you're going with your objection, which is that, well, just because a position has explanatory power or because it can be inferred, it doesn't prove that it's true. That's correct when it's a situation of normative discourse or a simple law of logic, but the claim here is different because.
Hang on, wait. Let me just try and get my head around what he just said. So the standard way, right? We might say we've got like competing explanations. I don't know, for a cause of the beginning of the universe, or why, you know, like a case. A thing I keep bringing up is like there's a shattered glass window, a brick on the floor, and a TV's missing, right? And then you've got like competing explanations. So there's the explanation that demonic entities came through and knocked a brick out and dropped that brick, and then they disappeared with the TV, maybe. That's like one competing explanation. Another explanation, right, is that a burglar threw a brick through the window and nicked the TV. And then another explanation is that 3 burglars did it. And then it's like, okay, so let's look at the case of the demon. Well, that says, for example, everything in the physical world exists, but then there's also demons. And then, you know, what's the kind of base rate probability of demon involvement in cases like this? And, you know, apparating out of existence, is that something we know can happen? The brick being dislodged from the wall, is that really explained? Now let's look at that third explanation, that 3, yeah, I think you get the picture anyway. So like, obviously we can look at our explanatory virtues. We can say, what are we committed to in each of these explanations? Well, the one where there's 1 burglar posits the least amount of entities that are sufficient to bring about the effects that we see. So only, you know, 1 burglar is needed to do all of that stuff. We don't actually need to put any more forward. so until there's some kind of further evidence, say like 2 different kinds of treads of footprints or something, then at that point we might say, well, it's actually simpler to explain it in terms of 2 burglars than it is that there's 1 burglar who swapped his shoes halfway through or something. But you see how we're kind of comparing explanatory virtues in that case. Whereas what Jay Dyer is saying is it's not like that. We can't do that because in this case, we're talking about paradigmatic worldviews, which are circular. Now, I can't see how the talk of because you could, and this just is what people like Graham Oppy are doing in the philosophy of religion literature, right? Is looking at complete worldviews as coherent webs of belief and saying which of these has the fewest ontological commitments, which of these has the best fit to the data, and so forth. So I don't see how Jay's getting out of that. It just seems like there's a part of me that wants to say what's going on here is he's just like, oh, look over there, a squirrel. Like, and then he mentions a bunch of philosophical stuff, and then in the hopes you sort of get bamboozled. But I don't think I wonder if he thinks it makes sense, or I don't know. I'm just going to play it before,
because it's about paradigms as a whole, not just logic, which is, I would say, is just a branch or one aspect of reality and philosophy.
I'm still trying to get a grip on what the form of the argument actually is, though, and maybe it would be helpful if you could state it as premises and a conclusion.
Well, the argument again is that if one accepts that there are transcendental preconditions, which some philosophers dispute that notion, I'm well aware of that. For example, a lot of, say, modern transcendental arguments are like linguistic categories that Carl Otto Appel does work in. Other people at Cambridge do work in transcendental arguments related to logic, and some do ethics and linguistics. So, but I'm just trying to be clear that I'm not making that argument.
Like, I don't even know. Some people at Cambridge work in ethics. Some people at Cambridge work in linguistics. Why is this being mentioned? This is bizarre.
There's it's similar forms of argumentation. For example, if you look at Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that's a mathematical version of a transcendental argument where it's appealing outside of itself to justify.
Okay, maybe I'm going to say something wrong here. But my understanding of Gödel's incompleteness theorem is that it's showing that there are certain axioms which can't be proved within a system, but I don't think it reaches outside of itself. It's just showing that it's showing the opposite. It's showing that from within the system, you can't prove these axioms, right? So something to do with Peano arithmetic axioms or something. Now, I don't think that that's doing the same sort of thing. It's not showing that there's like necessary preconditions. It's just showing there aren't proofs for certain things that you can get. Unless, is he saying you just have to presuppose those axioms, and that's the same of, I don't know. I mean, he'd have to say that sort of thing, though, right? I'm trying to interpret what he's saying for you.
By the system, right? He's pointing out that all sets appeal outside of themselves. So I'm not saying that the argument I'm making is exactly the same in terms of content as what Gödel's argument is. I'm making that type of an argument in a much more powerful way. So simply put, the argument is that if you don't presuppose the God of Orthodox Christianity, what you end up with is the impossibility of having any preconditions or any coherence or any possibility of life.
Wait, what? If you don't presuppose the God of Christianity, if you don't presuppose the God of Christianity, then you can't have, I don't even know what on earth.
Suppose the God of Orthodox Christianity, what you end up with is the impossibility of having any preconditions.
If you don't presuppose the God of Christianity, you end up with the impossibility of having any presuppositions
or any coherence or any
or coherence. Well, so he's made an actual claim here, right? And we could, I mean, you can just say that that's false because, you know, here's an example of someone who doesn't presuppose the God of Orthodox Christianity, me. And I can have presuppositions, I do, as here's Alex Malpass. I'm sure he's got some presuppositions, and so that statement that Jay's just made is wrong.
Possibility of logic, metaphysics, and ethics.
Impossibility of logic, metaphysics, and ethics.
Okay, good. That's helpful. So, let's say, would it be fair to put it like this then? So, if you said if you don't presuppose the God of Orthodox Christianity, then what's the consequence of that?
Then you can't have presuppositions, coherence, or ethics, or
logic, and these other preconditions, these other elements of our experience would be unintelligible. Would that be the way to put it? The intelligibility.
Yeah, correct. Correct.
Right,
Ultimately, they would lead to unintelligible conclusions. So that's not to say that a person who does not believe in Orthodox Christianity can't be.
Ultimately, they would lead to an unintelligible conclusion. I mean, what are the sufficient conditions for intelligibility? So it seems to me like maybe in terms of intelligibility, you might have to have like a commitment to like a mind existing, like a solipsism or something, and that would be like maybe maybe minds can't exist without matter, so perhaps you need a bit of matter, enough matter to be configured into a mind of some sort, and maybe a bit of space or stimulus or whatever for it to explore. But I can't see why you need a God in that.
Logician. It's not to say that a person who doesn't accept the totality position that I'm outlining can't do science or can't do logic or math. That's not what we're saying. But we're saying that in terms of overall consistency, that if let's say if I had a materialistic paradigm and I said, well, I don't accept your Christian theism. I believe in, say, just rank materialism. And I still do logic. My response to that person would be, well, yeah, you can do it in your daily life, but actually the justification for doing logic is itself.
You can do it, but here's what you actually believe. No.
Actually impossible and incoherent if you were to be consistent with conflicting presuppositions.
He should really, I think, point out what those conflicting presuppositions he thinks are. You can't just say, I imagine that you have some conflicting presuppositions. You don't even know what the person believes. Like,
Okay. So, I take it that. Well, okay. So, I take it that you think that this argument is being similar in heritage to Kantian arguments, such that we find in the Critique, like for instance,
it's only right. So it's only similar to Kant in the fact that the form of the argument is the same, just like the form of the argument is the same with Gödel and incompleteness set theory arguments. But what's different with Kant is that we don't psychologize it. We're not saying that the structures or the categories. Basically, if you want to make it simple, what Kant is saying about how the mind has transcendental preconditions that structure reality, we think that that's the mistake of Kant in terms of humanizing it and psychologizing it. And it really would make more sense if he attributed that to the mind of God, basically.
Okay, so just to be clear, and so what Kant's saying, and because presumably not everybody's read Kant, and certainly right. I imagine not everybody right now will. So what Kant's doing in the Critique, it's one of the most complicated and sort of pivotal books of philosophy in general, I guess, Western philosophy in general, probably the future philosophy and the Enlightenment. But what Kant is doing, so I'm going to not do justice to it in this brief summary, I'm just trying to say. But what Kant's up to some extent, is saying he's responding to skeptics who are making the claim that you couldn't know any synthetic truths a priori, right. Basically. You couldn't know anything about the way that things are, not analytic truths. You can know sort of just simply the meanings of words, how bachelors are all unmarried men. That's fair enough. You don't need any experience as such to tell that that's true. But whether there are any truths that are a priori, that means before experience, that are also synthetic, which is to say not true simply in virtue of the meanings of their words. Could there be any truths like that? And Kant says that there could be. And one of the examples that he gives is the structures. So he thinks that you can tell that we have to think of the world in terms of space and time and causality, right? Those are those two arguments. And effectively, the way that he gets there is by saying that with careful kind of phenomenological examination, really, is to say that you can just tell when you evaluate how consciousness is unified together, that if you didn't organize things in a spatiotemporal way that has causal relations built into it, that taking those elements out and seeing what's left of conscious experience leaves you with a kind of a mess. It leaves you with a booming, buzzing confusion that doesn't have any order or coherence to it, right? So he thinks that we have to think of as if space and time were real and causation was real. And so in that sense, it's a truth about the way that things are. It's a synthetic truth. It's not just about the meanings of terms. And it's known a priori because you can just tell using your own reason and examining the makeup of the way that your mind works. So that's a transcendental argument. But what that does is it says, unless we thought like this, unless consciousness was structured in this way, then the intelligibility of experience would become impossible. Now I see some similarities because you're linking it to the intelligibility of experience and specifically intelligibility of things like logic and causation and blah, 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 blah. And you're saying that those things would intelligibly impossible if we didn't have this precondition. But instead of so I think what I'm lacking that I see with Kant is we start off with a claim about the way that we have to see the world. And then there's the phenomenological inspection. That's the really hard stuff. Picking apart those bits and seeing why causation is required in order to see the world coherently. I'm still lacking clarity on why is it that seeing the world with the belief that God exists, it plays that role, structuring my experience in any way. Feels to me like I don't have that belief, but my experience is not a booming, buzzing confusion, right? So I have perfectly coherent thoughts. And you even said, you can be a logician and not have this belief. That makes it different to the Kantian. Is if you didn't have, for Kant anyway, I'm not saying he's right about this, but his is if you didn't structure things spatiotemporally and causally, you couldn't have any experience at all. So that makes your argument slightly different. So there's two things there. One is I don't see the connection between belief in the orthodox God and coherence in the same way that we get from a Kantian argument. And what was the second one? It's just popped out. I just said it, but I've already forgotten it. So maybe you can just reply as you can.
Well, yeah. So actually, that's a really great question. I'm glad you asked that question. So, and that helps to clarify how what I'm arguing for is strictly speaking not Kantianism. So I'm glad you went that direction. So the first thing I would say in response is that if you read,
I wonder that I find it really bizarre, like how confident Dyer comes across, and how he constantly, like as Alex is saying things, needs to sort of like reassure him that he's getting it right. Like, yeah. It's sort of really, really weird. Oh, it's good you went in that direction. Like it feels a bit like condescending.
Kant's prolegomena to any future metaphysics. It's the work where he realizes the problem that Hume has raised, and basically he says that Hume has shown us that if we begin with sense experience, that we cannot anymore do metaphysics. So when he moves to the critique that you're talking about, he wants to give a justification for metaphysics. But what I do is I would respond from my specific theological worldview, I'm going to do a presuppositional critique of Kant. And this is the same way that I would approach any of the philosophers. And the problem with Kant's presupposition is that it ends in psychologism. So Kant's divorce between the noumena and the phenomena means that he can never get to the external world. So for Kant, for example, to say that minds are structured in the way that he thinks they are, he needs to be able to have access empirically to other minds. But he's obviously not able to do that. Nobody is. We don't have empirical access to other people's experiences. So what I'm saying is that the traditional critique of Kant, I would actually agree with. We believe that Kantianism is flawed precisely because
Cut.
I don't think so. Let's see.
No. Don't know. Oh, think I'm back. Hopefully you can see me and hear me.
challenge of the fact that we can't have a synthetic a priori anymore. And Husserl gives multiple examples in his writings of things that actually are, just logically speaking, this doesn't really apply to God, but I'm just saying that technically speaking, Kant has been replied to by Husserl. And Husserl gives the example of redness. You will never experience redness apart from some object having redness, which he argues, and I think it's a valid argument, he argues that actually does satisfy.
I find this so interesting and bizarre because on the one hand, like Jay's mentioning a lot of stuff that you have to have spent like quite a lot of time to even be aware of, right? Like Kant's arguments, the distinction between like analytic and synthetic. Are there any like a priori synthetic? Is the synthetic a priori real? How have people dealt with that? Like to get to Husserl right in philosophy, you've got to. It's pretty obscure. It's not like the type of thing that people come across for a while. So on the one hand, it sounds like J. Dyer should know what he's talking about, but then it's very difficult to even really get anything. Like I don't even think he's put forward an argument yet. And he's not answered any of the questions that Alex has given to try and clarify what he's saying. So I don't know why he keeps mentioning like other bits of philosophy and like telling us like a narrative about the history of philosophy. At this point, it seems like he should have given an argument of some sort, and he still hasn't.
Kant's challenge for the lack of a synthetic a priori, but that's not really germane to my overall argument. My overall argument is that I would actually agree with you that Kantianism itself does not prove God's
My overall argument is that I would actually agree with you.
Existence in the way that I'm arguing for it. It's just that Kant did have insights when it came to usages of various transcendental categories, and I would simply say that for Kant's position, if I was talking to Kant, I would say, "Hey, bro, you got some good points there, but for your position."
This is the best bit, right? If Jay was talking to Kant, he'd say, "Hey, bro, you got some good stuff." Oh man,
to really work the way you're wanting it to work, you've got to have other things that you're missing. Namely, our deity would actually solve things because, for example,
but you've got to have some other things. You're not presupposing God. Like this is bizarre.
In the Christian worldview, there is a distinction between the external world and the individual and his consciousness, which this is again, historic problem in philosophy is how do we know there's an external world, this kind of stuff. If God created the world and if we are made in his image and we're distinct from animals and from the external world, then we avoid a lot of the say Far Eastern positions of Maya and that everything's illusory and everything's a projection of my mind. Right? A lot of philosophies believe this. So again, what I would say is there's actually a presuppositional critique that we would do of Kantianism to show that just because Kant's doing transcendental arguments, it doesn't mean that he's doing the kind of argumentation that we're doing. Just like with Gödel.
He's just saying, what is he actually saying? Seriously. Hey, bro, you've got a problem that you're not believing the exact same thing as me. But what are you saying? Please tell me what you're saying.
Even though Gödel's using a transcendental argument, it's not the kind of argument it's not the content of the argument is not the same as what I'm doing, even though the form of the argument is the same. And so when you were talking about a person doing logic who doesn't have my worldview, what I'm saying is that if you think back to your discussion that you had, for example, with Dark Dawkins, if we talk about induction in nature, right, regularity in nature, which is actually absolutely necessary for the scientific method itself, the scientific method presupposes things like logic, like regularity in nature. And as we said, from Hume all the way up to William Van Orman Quine, there's not a logical justification for induction itself. And so the solution I would say is that, well, if the world is created in a way in which there's a God who providentially guides nature.
Hang on. So here we go. I'm just going to bring up sticky notes. Oh no, sticky notes. I'm going to type out what he's actually saying, so it sounds like there's an argument coming. Oh, what's this? What's going on with my sticky notes? I've like trashed my computer now. This is bad. Oh, there's my sticky note. That was why. I was seeing it on the screen. If the world is created...
So, well, if the world is created in a way in which there's a God who providentially...
In a way in which there's a God who providentially
guides nature, who has set up nature to operate.
Guides nature. That's the first premise.
Operate in a providential way. That does explain how there could be induction, right? That isn't.
That explains how there could be induction. I'm guessing he's
mean that when you don't believe that you don't still on a day-to-day basis operate on the basis of induction. You do. But the question.
Right. So I don't know. You can't quite see that, can you? Can I make it bigger? No. I don't know how to make sticky notes bigger. Oh, I have no idea. Well, that didn't help. But it's just the point is I don't know if you can see it, but if the world is created in a way in which there's a God who providential, I know I've typed it all wrong, providentially guides nature, that explains how there could be induction. There is induction. Well, that would be affirming the consequent first. If this was actually in like a deductive form, it would be fallacious, right? Because he'd be affirming the consequent. And then secondly, he said it's not in deductive form because well that explains how there could be induction, but it doesn't rule out that there are any other explanations, right? Someone else could provide could also provide an explanation. He'd need something built into the premises. Like
is rather a meta level question of, well, how could you, if there is a way, could it possibly be justified to believe in induction? Is there a way to justify meta logic? Is there a way to justify meta ethics? So that's distinct. It's like another level of looking at the question rather than just kind of the ground level of, this versus that, your claim versus my claim, etc.
Okay, so again, I'm trying to pick between two different let's see, which way do I want to go? All right, so I think, well, let's look at the problem of induction for a moment. I guess, obviously, if you can say, so if your solution to the problem of induction is to say, well, I mean, if there was a God that providentially agreed certain regularities would obtain, then
right.
the question of whether or not there would be regularities wouldn't be so difficult to deal with. I think that's
right.
fair enough. On the other hand, it feels like if you're allowed to do that, then I could just say, well, if there just are regularities in nature, I mean, if you're allowed to make a kind of gross metaphysical assumption,
right.
then the problem of induction is not going to be a problem anymore because, well,
right.
that makes those types of assumptions.
See, if we it is definitely affirming the consequent, because if we look at the form that Jay just gave, right? So what's going on with my keyboard? Is that and? Why is that an and? That shouldn't be and. Is it like reverted to German? That's, what the hell? Right. Anyway, I'm going to try. I'm just going to type like this. So let's look at just the form of what Jay is saying, right? So if God exists, which is P, then that explains the problem of induction, or then there would be regularities in nature. There are regularities in nature, therefore God exists, right? Now let's look at this form with some other premises. So if it's raining, then the floor gets wet. The floor is wet, therefore it's raining. Now the reason that this isn't valid is that it doesn't actually have to be, so it raining, P, would guarantee that the floor is wet, okay? But there's also other possible explanations of the floor being wet. So it could be the case, for example, that P is false and Q is true, and then this Q would be true, but not P would be the case. That is a consistent proposition. So for example, the floor could be wet because someone's just spilt water, right? The floor could be wet because someone's just got out of the shower and gone for a run naked or something like that. And so, like the same with Jay's thing with like there could be regularities in the laws of nature because the machine elves just happen to be regularly maintaining everything, or so. Like it doesn't guarantee the antecedent of what he's put in there.
About the way the world works is what induction is saying you can't do. So if you're allowed to do that, that short circuits the problem of induction. But it seems kind of trivial. If there are regularities in nature, then the problem of induction goes away. So that doesn't feel very satisfying as a response to me to the problem of induction.
Well, the problem of induction is a problem for anybody's worldview. Okay, so it's not something like unique to an empiricist, it's an issue that could be raised in anybody's belief system. And the specific philosophical debate, as I'm sure you're aware, was over the possibility of justifying it, right? So if you read Hume's writings, he kind of goes through all these possibilities, and he essentially comes to the conclusion that he doesn't believe there can be a logical epistemic justification for belief in the regularity of nature. And then, so there's debates obviously throughout the next several centuries, but most people tend to accept William Van Orman Quine's famous essay that the two dogmas of empiricism are still dogmas. So he was making the point in that essay, and he's an empiricist. He's just saying, look, it still doesn't look like there's any way from basic sense experience to justify a claim about regularity in the future. It's not possible. So typically speaking, philosophers don't believe that there is an empirical, strictly logical justification for induction. And I would just say that for us in our worldview, it makes sense because there is regularity in nature, because of divine providence. And I understand your objection. You're saying, well, yeah, but if that's the way you're going to operate, you could basically just kind of bring in anything at any point where there's a problem. And that's not what we're saying, because maybe I should have mentioned this kind of when I was opening up the discussion. But in my view, when we talk about things that are, say, logical claims, or when we talk about a metaphysical claim, or even a claim about sense experience, I don't believe that claims operate outside of a paradigm of beliefs. So there's no such thing in my view as brute neutrality or brute factuality, or that claims aren't theory laden. I believe all claims, even a simple claim like something about a law of logic, or something about the cat is on the mat in front of you in your sense experience, all claims of any nature, I believe, are theory laden, and they kind of necessarily do presuppose and entail a lot of other beliefs, even if the claim itself doesn't specify those beliefs. So real quickly, to maybe answer your question, is I would say, look, there's no such thing as making a claim that's, say, only about logic or only about ethics. If you make an ethical claim, I literally believe that you're also presupposing things about metaphysics and epistemology, even if you're not interested in dealing with them. I'm not saying you personally, but people theoretically. Even if you don't want to talk about metaphysics or epistemology, if you make an ethical claim, there is still implicit in that all kinds of presuppositions about metaphysics and epistemology, even though the specific domain under which we're under the immediate purview is ethics. So in response, I'm saying that in response.
Just before we go into Alex's response, so I'm pretty sure this is just going to be in relation to a posteriori, who put so God is a necessary condition for the possibility of transcendentals. I don't know why I can't say that word. Transcendentals exist, but I'm not sure if that's valid, because I'm pretty sure that if you logically that is this again. So I think that here what this says that P is necessary for Q, right? And then you're saying Q to affirm P, but that would be again affirming the consequent, right? Yeah, sorry, it's an Irish name. Cian. I'm very sorry. What you need here is if, right? Oh my God, everything is falling apart. But if you just have it as P is necessary for Q, then you've still got the same problem as before. That's my hot take.
I'm saying that
what? Yeah, but you keep saying, right? So you keep saying if you say disjunctive syllogism, right? That doesn't really add anything, because Jay hasn't said. So what's Jay just saying? God or not God? Not God, therefore God, or something like. What are the premises in the disjunctive syllogism if it is that? He hasn't said anything of that form.
It's not like it's only a question about the regularity of nature, because the possibility of doing science isn't just about the regularity of nature. It also presupposes that a scientist has a self and a consciousness and able to interact with an external world that's meaningful, that's separate from him, whereby he can do logical experiments that are based on, he can do the scientific process based on logic. And I think Husserl has shown definitively in logical investigations that the scientific method absolutely presupposes abstract logic. Then we start to see that none of these things actually operates independently and on their own. They actually kind of necessitate all these other categories and transcendentals that I'm trying to say are all necessary.
Okay, good. So, I mean, I agree with plenty of what you're saying about the interrelatedness of our concepts, right? And I don't
awesome.
think
most people don't, but that's awesome.
I mean, I don't think that it's easy to draw those lines between the areas, but it seems weird to imagine that there are no lines between them at the same time.
Well, I don't understand there are no lines.
No, but so I agree with you in the sense that I think that there are lines between those areas. I'm just not sure that I know what they are. Anyway.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even claim there's a clear distinction at times between when something might be strictly epistemic or when, yeah, there's fuzzy areas on that. I agree.
Okay, so but to go back to induction, it feels I'm not quite sure if you got what I was saying, because I think that maybe this is just my fault. So the problem of induction, right, is that
there's so much like weird stuff going on with Jay, like the body language and the like face movements, licking, interrupting. It's like a behavioral disorder or something.
Let's say you're a scientist encountering some regularity, right? Like you're doing an experiment and you're repeatedly getting the same results from your experiment in similar conditions, right? And you might, after a while, start to say to yourself, well, here's a hypothesis, right? There's a law of nature, which I've stumbled over, right? Which is that every time this happens, that thing happens, right? And that's the law, and that's what's going on. It's the explanation of the regularity that I seem to be observing here. Now, here's where the skeptic pops up, right? Because the skeptic can say, well, maybe not, right? Not so fast. What you might have stumbled across is just a coincidence, right? So like the turkey thinks that it gets fed every day up until Christmas, right? And thinks it's going to get fed tomorrow. So he hasn't stumbled across a law of nature, which is every day the farmer gives me. It's just.
I'm muted. Sorry.
Okay. So the turkey found like conditions following circumstances, but he wasn't stumbling across a law of nature with no causal structure that he'd connected to. It was just a bunch of coincidences because he was wrong the next time he made that inference to being fed on Christmas Day.
Could you repeat that? You kind of cut out. Could you repeat the example you gave?
Just let you know real quick, Dr. Malpass, when your dog barks, your mic drops down below the threshold, and so
that's my fault. It's here, so I'm going to start. It's my
okay. Whatever dog it is. Okay.
I'll mute it when I'm not talking.
For once, it's not my dog. Okay, so what I'm saying is, let me start again then. So you could be a scientist sitting in a lab doing some experiment, and you're in like conditions of finding like consequences. Right? So you do the measurement the same way every time. It feels like you get the same result coming out the other end, and you start to think to yourself, hey, maybe there's my hypothesis is that what's going on. There's a law of nature, right? There's a causal connection between the circumstances of the experiment and the outcome. Right? One's causing the other. I found a causal relation here. And then the skeptic pops up and says, hold on a minute, not so fast, right? This might just be a coincidence. And the analogy is like, so the turkey who's getting fed every day throughout December up until Christmas Day, who assumes, hey, every day I got fed up till now is a kind of causal relationship between, the farmer coming out and pouring grain down in my food bowl, whatever it is. So he thinks that's stumbled across a causal relation too, but obviously that's he's wrong, right? Because there is no causal relation there, because on Christmas Day, farmer comes out and wrings his neck, right? So the idea is that the scientist could always be in that situation, right? No matter how many observations he does, he can't really tell that what it looks like a regularity to him isn't just a coincidence, right? He can't really tell whether he stumbled across a law of nature or not. That's the problem of induction. And the Christian answer that I'm hearing is that, well, God can, maintain nature in such a way that there are regularities. I understand that as an answer, but what I'm satisfied with about it, apart from the fact that I could just make a similar metaphysical assumption, which is, or maybe there are just regularities in nature, right? It's a kind of equivalent metaphysical assumption. But it seems to me we're still in the same boat, in exactly the same epistemic boat that we were in prior to making that assumption. And here's the problem, right? Let's imagine, let me grant you all of the premises of that argument. So the Christian worldview is true, God exists, God maintains regularities in nature. All of the revelation that comes through, let's say, the Bible, teachings of the church, blah, 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 any revelation you like. I'm assuming you don't believe God reveals personally by speaking in your head to you or whatever, right? Most Christians don't have that view of revelation. But assuming you more or less stand a view of revelation, it seems to me that God doesn't tell you through revelation whether or not your experiment that you're doing is a regularity or if it's just a coincidence, right? So if you go outside your house and step into the road without looking, maybe that you never get run over, right? But you don't know whether that regularity is going to be continued in the future or whether it's going to be interrupted. So that the problem of induction still faces you. Even if I grant you all of the bits of your argument, you are still in exactly the same place when you're faced with something that looks like a regularity of not knowing whether it's a coincidence or in fact a causal law. But I don't see that it actually helps you with the problem of induction at all, even if I grant you everything.
So the first thing I would say in response is that just because we believe in theism, you are correct that it does not mean that you're going to automatically have a better result in your scientific experimentation. I fully grant that. And that wasn't the argument that I was trying to get across. We all still, if we're doing experimentations based in the natural world, it's always going to be fallible. But what I'm trying to stress, I think, is that the problem of induction is not just a question about How do we know about when our scientific experiments are just coincidence and when they're not? It's much more than that. If you read Hume, and again, the hundreds of years of actually debate on this question, all the way up to Quine, the debate is actually about the logical justification, the epistemic justification of believing in the principle of regularity in nature. That's specific, and that's different from the.
So he just said the problem in Hume is the logical justification, the epistemic justification. Now, those are two different things. And again, it's a matter of interpreting what Hume's saying, right? So actually, quite a lot of people do think it's not just an epistemic problem. It's Galen Strawson who interprets it to say, well, it is just an epistemic problem, but Hume actually still believes in necessary connection or something. But it's unclear to me that it seems weird that someone could read Hume, be aware of the kind of things that Hume says, be aware of the problem of induction, right, and then also say something like it's a logical. That's not the problem. It's a logical problem. It's an epistemic problem, as if the logical and epistemic problem are the same thing, and the metaphysical one is really, really weird.
Just the question of reliability in scientific experimentation and how do you know you're discovering a law or not. So it's a specific question about logic and justification. And what I'm saying is that one thing I would say to you that might help distinguish the argument I'm making from what you're saying is that I would say that different things are proven in different ways. So not everything is going to be proven in an empirical way. So for example, the scientific method itself, if we were to ask the question of how do we know that the scientific method is actually a thing or a conceptual model or system or tool that we can rely on and use, how do we logically justify believing in that itself? Now, you can't just say, well, because we do experiments and it works, because as Hume pointed out, that's kind of just sort of assuming the thing that's being asked, right? So what happens is that the debate on this question becomes more fundamental. It becomes a question of a fundamental paradigmatic level question where we ask, how can we justify something that goes out of sense experience if we only limit our beliefs to what are confined to sense experience, right? So the empiricist tradition has this problem within it, and anybody who adopts naive empiricism as a philosophy or a worldview or an approach to the external world ends up with a logical problem and an epistemic problem. Now, it may not affect their day-to-day scientific activities in terms of how successful their theories are, because theories are they're very precise, they're very niche. Scientists specialize in very compartmentalized areas. But the philosophy of science is asking different questions. It's asking, again, meta-level questions, not questions of basic logic, not questions of basic empiricism, basic sense experience. It's asking meta-level questions about the justification of the possibilities of those things, right? So again, the kind of questions that Kant was raising appropriately, but in my view, not answering appropriately. And so again, in the same way, I would say that if we look at something like a question of at what temperature does water boil, right? This is a basic kind of scientific experiment where we would engage in empirical results, right? To determine, well, we have a lot of reliability that, 99.9% of the time, everywhere water seems to boil at, this temperature, right? But if we're asking a question about not specific sense experiences and the phenomena of experience, we're asking a more fundamental question of, well, how do we justify, can we justify? Right? Some people don't think we can. Can we ask the question of how do we justify relying on the scientific method itself? It's a more fundamental meta-level question that Hume is asking, right? And it is a debate from Hume all the way up to Quine in the present day. And that the consensus of most empiricist philosophers, unless they become an idealist, which is what Kant did. Kant was a form of German idealism. Hegel, he goes into that German idealist tradition. So they go a route of idealism. I'm not an idealist, but I'm just saying that some philosophers have attempted to kind of grapple with these issues by going into the idealist/Platonist school.
Yeah, he just said he's not an idealist, but he's been talking about coherentism a lot. Very confused.
But we don't believe that. We're not Platonists, but we're also not anti-science. I don't believe that you can get away from doing science and experimentation. I believe science is fully reconcilable to the Orthodox Christian worldview personally. So what I'm saying is that different things are proven different ways. And so the kind of argument that I'm making, or the way that we would go about justifying, and again, if we were to say, well, how could you justify something that's not empirical? I would say that the kind of argument that's going to be necessitated for the possibility of justifying that would be something more abstract. It's not going to be an argument that's the same type of argument of how we would prove things in the physical world, right? And you can't just respond by saying, well, yeah, but until we see physical evidence of those things, we have no reason to believe that they exist. That's actually another empiricist fallacy, because the empiricist himself typically has to believe in things that he can't empirically justify. Again, this problem of regularity, the scientific method itself, conceptual realities, meanings behind words. These are all non-physical, non-empirical things that cannot be justified in the typical way of justification. So in the history of logic, all the way back to Aristotle and transcendental arguments, the only type of argument that you could give to justify something that fundamental, right, like the laws of logic. So when Aristotle's arguing with the sophists. The sophists are the classic skeptics, the classic sophists, the classic relativists. They say, Aristotle, this is all well and good, but what would you say to me, Aristotle, if I come to you and I deny the possibility of the law of non-contradiction? And Aristotle responds by saying, when you engage in argument, you're assuming the laws of logic to begin with. And if you deny the law of non-contradiction, you're assuming the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction in its denial. So Aristotle gives that transcendental argument, which, because it's at that level, if something is at that level and it's so fundamentally self-refuting at that circularity level, we would say that is a valid argument. I would say it's a valid argument. Now, some philosophers will dispute that. If they do, I would go down a different route of saying that I think you would be forced to adopting that position if you looked at the fact that you cannot justify. That's why we always go back to Hume, transcendental argument proponents. We always go back to Hume because we have to go back to pointing out that if you start with, say, that the basic assumptions of all knowledge coming through sense experience, as a lot of people do, for example, there's no way to justify that belief itself in a strictly logical, formal way. It has to be assumed. And again, to my knowledge, every empiricist from Hume up to Quine has agreed with that on a strictly logical, formal basis.
Okay, so let's talk about Aristotle for a second then. So you made the claim there that Aristotle provides a transcendental justification for the law of non-contradiction, which is a view, I guess, but I would say that was a minority view for sure. I think I have pretty good reasons for that's a minority view. So I take it we're referring to Metaphysics, book 4?
I don't have it in front of me, but off the top of my head, I have read the entire Metaphysics. It's either 4 or 7, going from memory, but it's specifically it's a well-known passage where he's arguing with the sophists, and the sophists ask him to justify the law of non-contradiction, and he makes an argument from the possibility of the contrary, which is a transcendental argument.
I am not so convinced that that's what's happening there. So Metaphysics 4 is one of the bits of Aristotle I know quite well. I haven't read Metaphysics from cover to cover. I was just saying to Steve,
okay. Well, let me ask you. Let me ask you a question before we go in that route. Do you understand that in our position we believe that a reductio at that level is a transcendental argument? It is what he does is a reductio to the surface, right? And he says that the assumption of logic, to deny the laws of logic would still assume them, and you would be led to a denial of the very fundamental. And by the way, this is as far as you're the first person I've heard that doesn't believe this. As far as I know, any standard treatment of the history of transcendental arguments will go back to Aristotle's Metaphysics. But even if I'm wrong, which I don't think I am, I'm 95% sure going from memory, because I took a lot of grad classes on Aristotle, and so we actually dealt with this whole question. But I'd be interested to hear how you don't think that it is a transcendental argument.
I mean, to be fair, scholars disagree, right? It's an area where scholars disagree, just like lots of Aristotle, right? I mean,
sure,
there's three bits of Aristotle I have good knowledge on. This bit, the prior analytics in general, categorical syllogism, and the sea battle argument on interpretation. Those, I mean, I have a passing acquaintance with most of it, but I mean, those are the 3 bits I have a good to academic level knowledge on. Anyway, so this particular bit, right? So we're talking about a book of Aristotle's called the Metaphysics, which is where he's talking about kind of first principles and sort of fundamental questions of that nature. These are things that are studied by no science in particular, no special science in particular, right? Common to all special sciences. And in book 4, there's this section which really like, I guess, chapters 3 to 6 or something, 3 to 8 maybe, where, as you say, he is talking about the law of non-contradiction, which he describes as the firmest of all principles, and he introduces the idea of various opponents, among them Protagoras, who's a sophist, Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, and a couple of others, Democritus, whatever, a bunch of other people. And Aristotle was famously uncharitable to his opponents, so he gives these really terrible renditions of what they say. So he says that Protagoras, for instance, he was a kind of relativist who's famous for saying things like man is the measure of all things. So Aristotle takes that to mean something like, well, he's saying that truth is completely relative, right? So something might be true for me, but it's not true for you. And then Protagoras is kind of committed to the idea that it's both true and not true, right? Because it's true for me and not true for you. Now, Protagoras is a relativist, right? That's true, but whether he's committed to the law of non-contradiction or being true for that reason is very dubitable. Anyway, Heraclitus says everything is in flux, right? So, in Socrates is both youth and age, right? Because he changes. And Aristotle thinks that means he's saying it's true that Socrates is young, and it's not true that Socrates is young. That's very uncharitable reading of what Heraclitus is saying. Anyway, so he sets up his opponents like that, and then gives a series of, well, quite complicated arguments. I think it's 7 arguments, right? But there's the one long famous one that starts in chapter 4, which I think is what you're referring to. So what most of the discussion about whether that's a transcendental argument. I'd be very surprised if it was one of the others. But to begin with, he sets it up by saying there's no direct demonstration, right? To ask for a demonstration of the firmest of all principles is to show want of education, right? Because not everything can be demonstrated.
Right. That's absolutely agree. That's what I've been arguing.
Well, but that's to say that there's no direct way of proving that the law of non-contradiction is true. What he says then is that, well, we can still give it
by the impossibility of the contrary. Yes, that's an indirect argument. I just said that before you started.
So, well, he says you can give an indirect proof. He says you can demonstrate indirectly if only you can get your opponent to say something, right? And then the preceding chapters or whatnot sets out one long argument. And your claim is that what happens in that next preceding set of arguments is that and I think these are 2 different things, right? The first being proves it by reductio or impossibility of the contrary, and then the other one is making the claim that to even voice the question is to presuppose that it's true. I think those are 2 different types of, so they're not the same thing.
They're variations on the same point.
Well,
I mean, yes, you're correct. You're correct that technically speaking, to critique the opponent's attempt to say something, and also pointing out in a separate section that an indirect argument is different from, I mean, technically they're literally two different things, but it's a variation on the same form of argument. That's why I was talking about how Gödel's incompleteness theorems are the same form of argument, but they're not the same content of the argument that I'm making.
Okay, so let's take them one at a time. So to take first the idea of showing that the law of non-contradiction is true through a reductio seems to me to be question begging, right? And the reason is that, well, a reductio or impossible contrary argument. So let me set out my stall, and then you can see, I can see what way.
No.
So a reductio argument has the following form, right? So it's to say, let's imagine we want to prove that P is true. What we would do is assume not P is true for the sake of the argument, and then derive from not P some pair of contradictory propositions, say Q and not Q. And then by deriving the contradiction, we can then infer back that not P must be false. And then we can infer back from that to show that P must be true. And so that's the method of reductio. You assume the contrary, and you show that it leads to a contradiction. And then you work backwards to the thing you were trying to prove. But the point and the reason that it's question begging in this context is if your opponent is actually making the claim, unlike Protagoras or Heraclitus, that there is a contradiction, right, which is what it would mean to say that the law of non-contradiction is false. If your opponent is making a claim that there is a contradiction, to then use the reductio method by showing that his view leads to a contradiction, it's kind of pointless, right? Because he's admitting that that's his claim. It doesn't follow from his claim that is his claim. So he obviously he wouldn't see that as any reason to reject the view, because that is his view. So you're begging the question if you think that showing someone is committing a contradiction is a reason for them to give up the view, if they're who thinks that it's true that there's a contradiction. So you can't, I mean,
right.
Maybe
what you're not.
Right.
Go ahead. Sorry.
That's it. Sorry.
There's a lag. I'm not trying to cut you off. There's a little bit of lag. So when I think you're done, I start talking, and then I don't realize you're not done. So go ahead.
No, I am in fact done. So crack on.
Okay. Yeah. What I would say is that what I think you're missing is that in normative discourse and in normative argument, you're correct. And as I said kind of early on,
this is kind of painful for me to watch at this point. Like, it's so difficult to even. I find it so difficult to continue to like try and make sense of what like Jay's saying, and the constant like interruptions, lack of clarity, randomly telling us like every fact he knows about philosophy rather than the question, those sorts of things.
On circular arguments or fallacies. But what's unique here is that at this level of discourse, when we're actually questioning something that's a precondition for language and communication and meaningful discourse itself, like the law of non-contradiction, that's so fundamental that it's a unique situation. At this level, the reductio here is not a typical reductio. It's actually it's so fundamental of a reductio that it reduces his position to the impossibility of even talking or arguing at all. So it's not, it's not like the if you and I were debating the existence of I don't know, cheese on the moon, right? We would maybe send a craft to the moon. And
I mean, again, I want to say that this is just special pleading, because what other than logic, what other than, you know, that reductio ad absurdum is a valid argument form? What could he be appealing to offer like these propositions up as demonstrating the proposition that God exists as following from them? I genuinely do not know what the hell he thinks he's doing. How could you have? Why is it different? Because Alex is right. The very thing in question is just whether these particular laws of logic, say, exist, right? So if the person who you're talking to denies that they exist, then yeah, of course they're going to say that that's an invalid form of inference to make. To say that you've proved a contradiction. Well, if you believe that there are no contradictions, I can show. If you believe that there are legitimate contradictions, then I can show there's a contradiction, right? And it's like, yeah, because that's what I'm saying. Genuinely don't know. A posteriori says, address the real meat, Nathan, the transcendentals. If they exist, then they need a God cause. I don't even think that that's true. I mean, I don't even know what Jay means by transcendentals, really. I don't know. Yeah, I don't even know what he means by transcendentals. I'm going to assume, and I could be wrong, that he means something like the laws of logic, maybe like categories, species, genera, the good, the beautiful, maybe. Again, I've no idea. I mean, I think that they could exist, right? And something like Aristotelianism could be true, where they exist in the particulars, say. Or maybe there's a world of just necessary Platonic objects, right? I don't really see why a god would explain that. I've no idea why a god is like a better explanation of that than just like an abstract, Platonic form heaven or whatever just necessarily exists. Couldn't have been otherwise.
Investigate, right? We would have these debates about the evidence and this and that, right? That's not the same thing as when you're at the level of questioning logic itself. That's so fundamental and so paradigmatic that at that level, I believe questions take on a circularity that's unavoidable. And that's why I was talking early on about coherence theory. So what Aristotle's pointing out here is that even though he's making a variation on one point here, and then he's attacking from a different angle over here, it's still the same point. And at this level, I believe reductios, they actually move out of the normal. I mean, they're typically fallacies anyway, but this is at the level of paradigms and preconditions of speaking or thinking at all. So you can't. It is a transcendental argument because it's a reductio against a position that destroys the possibility of logic at all.
Okay, so I'm not following why.
So this is what I noticed in your discussion with Art Dawkins, where I think you're misunderstanding about my position. I'm not defending him, but my position is that you seem to think that logical arguments always operate in the exact same way, or no matter what question you're talking about, anything is proven in the exact same way. And I don't think that they are. For example, the way that we would go about proving a really complex math problem is very different, although not totally unrelated, but very different from the way that we would go about proving something that, say, relates to empirical science, right? So there's different ways to prove different things. And what I think the miscommunication we're having is that we believe that at the level of paradigmatic questions, the kinds of questions that Thomas Kuhn raised about science operating on the basis of paradigms. I'm not saying, by the way, that Kuhn is right about everything, but he's right about pointing out that ultimately science rests on different paradigms. When you're at that level, things don't operate the same way, right? And that's why Gödel is useful in this regard, because Bertrand Russell kind of had the view that you have, that like, well, we can just logically show maybe that anything in.
That's why Gödel is right, because Bertrand Russell kind of had the same view that like it's like just all this.
In a set is logically axiomatic and follows from the first steps. And Gödel shows that no, ultimately the set has to appeal outside of itself. It becomes circular at a certain point. And we're saying the same thing about logical claims, that this, when you question the law of non-contradiction or the laws of logic themselves, this is not just any normal kind of discourse. This is a metalogical question. So it enters into another sphere of, when you doubt or go against those things, it's totally destructive to the possibility of knowledge at all. So it's not a typical reductio at that level.
Okay, so So first of all, I'm not sure why. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean then when you say that it's a reductio argument, because that's a reductio argument. So if it's got a different form,
yeah, but it's a reductio at the level of paradigms, which is stronger than and much more devastating than a reductio at the level of debating, whether there's cheese on the moon, or debating whether, I have a better internet connection to you, or debating the kind of normative day-to-day empirical.
What does he mean? It's strong. Like, does he mean it's more important? I mean, that would be true, but it's not like the rules of inference are different or something.
Stuff is not of the same level as when you're debating the possible
level. Well, I suppose it isn't at the same level of reality, and it's more fundamental, but it's just the same form.
Ability of logic itself, right? Don't you think that something like that is different than, even though they could be related, they're different questions. Like if I say I don't believe in, I don't know, let's take something that's kind of like a scientific thing that most, like, I don't believe that there's extraterrestrial life. Okay, in my worldview, I don't believe that, and I actually don't believe in aliens. Right? That's a different kind of claim than if I were to say there are no laws of logic and they can't be justified. Now, I believe that we could argue and prove.
Okay, it's a different kind of claim.
Perhaps either of these questions, but they're two different types of questions, and so I think again the mistake here is trying to.
Well, they're not. I mean, they're different questions. They're not different. I mean, they're questions about different types of thing or different things. I
think that everything is proved in the same way. It's not the way that we go about doing daily discourse.
They're proved in different ways. Okay. I mean, I suppose the existence of extraterrestrials would be proved by encountering extraterrestrials a posteriori, whereas like a reductio is like an a priori it's just basically if you probe around with the rules of inference, one of your axioms is basically going to be that from a contradiction, anything would follow. So if you can derive if from A, you can draw out some contradictory pair of claims like C and not C, then that allows you to infer not A must be the case. I wonder if there's any cases where I suppose there could be cases where both sides draw out a contradiction, but then maybe that would just be a different form of argument. But I have no idea what J actually means.
Or science is not going to be proven in the same way that we would prove or justify meta level questions. And the reason for that is because at the meta level, things operate in a different way, and they're much more devastating if we deny them or if we doubt them. If I doubt the existence of the external world, and I really don't believe that there's an external world, if I follow through with that, there's going to be heavy consequences for my life, right? Like I might think that everything is a mental projection in my life. And so I can go around and I can loot and burn and I can become the God Emperor, but I'm probably going to have some severe consequences when I find out that the rest of the world doesn't share that view, right? So that's a fundamental kind of question, right? That's different than if I were to ask the question of, do I actually live next door to Lil Wayne? Like the dude over there kind of looks like Lil Wayne, but I don't think that it is. I deny I live next to Lil Wayne. So see how they're questions that could be resolved through logic and debate, but they're going to be proven in different ways because the nature of what's under discussion itself is different. And this is the key point I want to make. When you're talking about abstract entities, logical entities, number theory, any of that kind of stuff, philosophical concepts, preconditions, the way that they're going to be discussed and justified and proven, if one accepts that they can be proven, and I do, then the way that they're justified and proven is going to be different than the types of things that are not abstract, conceptual, invariant, and immaterial.
Okay, so let me try and, I've got three things on my mind I want to say, let me see if I can remember them. So the first one, I think, is that I agree that not everything is proven in the same way. I'm not, I wasn't for this even, like an epistemological monist or something, right? I don't think that there's only one way to find out how things are. I think that the way you go about proving a mathematical theorem is different to the way that you go about justifying, say, a historical claim or something.
Right.
It's two different types of claim, and there are other ones as well. The way I know that I'm in pain is different from the way that I prove a mathematical theorem as well. So that I'm not at all wedded to the idea that all knowledge is obtained in the same way. Just to clear that up, I think that I'm curious as to the idea that Aristotle could have said the same thing that you're saying, partly because you were saying that if you were calling into question anything so fundamental as the law of logic, then what happens when you entertain the idea that it might not be true is that you're plunged into some kind of situation that's something a bit like what Kant was saying would happen if you didn't think of the world spatio-temporally or something. Maybe it would just break down. But contrary to that, on interpretation, book 9, Aristotle ends up saying that he thinks that the law of excluded middle is false for future contingents. And so one of the three paradigmatic classical laws you think everyone associates with Aristotle, he argued against one of them. He didn't think that his worldview was fallen to pieces as a result of that. So it seems curious to me why he would think that questioning the law of non-contradiction would have that consequence if questioning the law of excluded middle patently didn't.
Right.
Okay, so and the final thing
by the way, can I add real quick about Aristotle? I have a severe critique of Aristotle. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm an Aristotelian. The only reason I brought in what I think is a transcendental argument for metaphysics is just to talk about the history of it. I'm not trying to defend Aristotle, and I have plenty of critiques of Aristotle. Go ahead, sorry.
And I don't think you are an Aristotelian, or you would be a Thomist instead of an Orthodox theologian. But look, I think that let's think about this a little bit more, right? So on your view of what Aristotle's saying, so let's just pretend that he didn't say that in on interpretation, because that's a massive exegetical issue for your view, it seems to me. But let's say his argument, and let's say somehow that...
well, actually, why would that be a problem for my view?
Well, because if the view is calling in logical laws leads your worldview to sort of crumble and become incoherent, then it wouldn't make sense with him calling into question the law of excluded middle, which is just as much of a logical law as the law of non-contradiction.
But the fact that Aristotle wasn't consistent really doesn't have anything to do with whether the positions are true or false or not. Okay, and in the posterior analytics, which is not actually about logic as such, but it's about the scientific method for Aristotle, and I don't have the reference off the top of my head, but there's a bit where and I'm happy to produce this at some point if needs be. But he points out there's this interesting passage where he says that the principle of non-contradiction is not presupposed by the theory of the categorical syllogism. Right? And he gives an example and says, for if it were effectively, I'm paraphrasing, but let's imagine that all A's are B and some A's are not B, then it would still follow that from all B's are C, that some A's are C. Right? So he's essentially saying that the form Barbara, which is the main one in the categorical syllogism, the one onto which all of the others can be reduced, would still be valid even if there were a contradiction. So what that shows you is not that he thinks that there are contradictions, he thinks there couldn't be contradictions, right? But he doesn't think that the system of the categorical syllogism requires there to be no contradictions. The inferences would still be valid even if there were contradictions. So he's explicitly saying that logic doesn't presuppose the law of non-contradiction there. And I find that that is, again, another exegetical question for you. If you're saying that he's logic presupposes the law of non-contradiction, how do you reconcile him explicitly saying that it doesn't? Right. So this is the reason why I don't reconcile him. Because ultimately, like if you listen to my critiques of Aristotle, I would be glad to point out to you that For example, he's extremely inconsistent when he talks about the fact that there's one unmoved mover, and then he talks about all the celestial spheres of the heavens, each having their own unmoved mover. Aristotle contradicts himself all the time, actually, in my view. I was just pointing out that he's the first person that we can see that makes this form of an argument. And it doesn't matter if he doesn't make that form of an argument elsewhere and contradicts himself.
Well, okay, so fair enough. I'm pointing out other areas where he seems to be saying stuff that's difficult to.
Okay, I wouldn't even have a problem granting you that. You're probably more of an Aristotelian scholar than I am. I had maybe 2 or 3 grad classes on him. I'm not an Aristotle expert, and I'm sure that you would have more contradictions that you can point out. But I just think in that section, and I think it is section 4, that's typically pointed to, where people think that he does make. If you look at just the form of the argument, it seems to be a reductio that is a transcendental argument because it's a question of the law of non-contradiction. If he's inconsistent with that elsewhere, I don't have any problem admitting that.
Yeah. Okay. So, but then I didn't expect us to talk about Aristotle this much, so maybe we can pause this after. The last thing I want to say about Aristotle is I think what's going on in section 4 is that he ends up saying, if only I could get my opponent to say something, I could trap him, right? And then he says, he's a long time saying, well, as long as he doesn't, do some crafty tricks like saying something but not really meaning anything by it. And obviously you can't also say something and mean 2 things by it at the same time, right? If you say this is a bank, the money bank, and it's not a bank as in a river bank, that doesn't.
Yeah, you can't play word game. Right.
Is say something unequivocally, right? Like I am a man, right? And not mean any other things by it. And these things, well, as soon as I can get someone to make that type of claim, right? They're making a stand on it. They're saying this is true and not also false, right? When you do that, that you're then therefore, the idea is that type of opponent can't think that the law of non-contradiction is false, right? But the thing is, it's a bad argument because you could believe that, say, the liar sentence is true and false, but think that the sentence I am a man is true and not false. So simply getting me to say one sentence doesn't get me to commit to the non-contradiction being true. I could still think there is.
No, actually, I would disagree. I disaagree with that. But even if I grant you this, ultimately, it's not germane to my overall argument. But I actually don't think that's true. I think that again, it's like first of all, I believe that there's a distinction between a contradiction and a paradox, and this is debated in logic.
Trevor's saying before the upload timestamp when you lost the will to live. Yeah, that's about right. So one thing I'm sort of Alex is saying interesting stuff, but it's very difficult to make any sense of what Jay's saying. So let's move on. I'm going to play something else, I guess. Jay, Dyer, and key jump. Let's watch it on Tom's channel, and let's just see how this goes a few months later. So this is like a year later, right?
Not happened, but whatever. Okay, we're on the air. It looks fine. Welcome, everybody, to the Kill Stream. I'm your host, Ethan Ralph, the owner and the editor-in-chief of theRockfortsword.com. It's good to see you guys here. We're starting off with Jay Dyer versus Tom Jump. And then we're going to go to Dick Masterson versus Andy Worski. That was a bonus bout that's been... Chrissy Mayer to email you at thereubenreport@thereubenreport.com. I'm sorry. Wolfen says, let's do this shit. Space Cowboy 14 says, lady has stank ass crack or crusty snatch. Choose. I don't know what that was in reference to, but whatever. Thank you. Guy Fieri's all with the Ninjagini. Thank you very kindly for that statement of support. Rainwreck with the diamond. Thank you as well. And you said this. Who put their butt cheeks on the kill stream graphic? Oh, I didn't think about that, but it does kind of look like that. All right. Did it? I guess, how about this? Tom, you go first. We have the opening statements. We'll let you go first since I have to pick somebody.
Sure. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there is no reason to believe in the existence of a God. And that's essentially my position. There's just a made up position, no different from leprechauns or fairies or Santa Claus. There's no evidence to indicate a God. All the experts in pretty much every academic field agree on that point. All of the arguments that apologists use are debunked and rejected by all the experts in every academic field because they're garbage. So yeah, I mean, apologetics is just another pseudoscience like homeopathy or flat earth. That's my position.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Dyer, as I try to fix the screen once again. Go ahead and speak.
All right, so obviously I disagree with that. I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I defend the Orthodox Christian position, and we believe that the only possible explanation for reality is the triune God, and that's because when we look at what we call a worldview in philosophy, that would be the disciplines of knowledge, or epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics. These are the 3 branches of philosophy. We really only see one type of being that can ground and give a coherent explanation, justification, and explanatory power to how it's possible for there to be knowledge, ethics, and claims about reality. So I'm making an argument at a paradigm level. It's called a transcendental argument. It's an argument about preconditions of experience. It's not an argument about experience itself, but rather the preconditions or what's necessary for the possibility of experience, knowledge, or ethics. So two different levels of argumentation. I can show you the logical form of that argument, show that it's a perfectly valid form of argumentation. So the argument is just simply that when we look at the world and when we make knowledge claims, when we make claims about ethics or metaphysics, there's all kinds of presuppositions or preconditions that are necessary and have to be the case for those knowledge claims to be possible. So I'm not talking about any specific knowledge claim in this case. I'm talking about a higher level, a meta level claim about the possibility of knowledge claims. So these preconditions are things like universals, abstract concepts, the status of objects, or the identity of objects over time, the principle of induction, the external world having a reality to it that's not just simply mental, that there is a self that underlies all of our perceptions. All of these things are not reducible to matter. They're not, in other words, it would lead to an absurdity reductio to reduce all of these preconditions to matter. And so therefore they do have some ontological existence, some real existence. And so the only possible way to explain how all of those interlock or cohere, numbers, laws of logic, the things I listed, is if there is a God who grounds them and is the justification for those things. So basically I'm saying that there are transcendental categories or preconditions, and the argument for God's existence is that
there's a massive burden of proof that Jay is taking on in giving this argument, isn't there? Like, I mean, it's not as if the existence of like universals, abstract objects, etc., is completely uncontested. And as James Fodor likes to say, that's a very like cluttered ontology that he's got there. And then he's also got to show that no other explanation for these things exists. And he's got to show that these are the necessary preconditions for, you know, intelligibility, that there aren't some other kind of, you know, so some lesser ontology that would be sufficient to bring about, you know, those kind of features of experience and intelligibility and stuff that he's trying to say. So that is just a massive, I don't think he's going to do it, but let's see. Yeah, you're right. Maybe to be fair, I mean, I suppose this video I'm specifically looking at the tag argument, but yeah, to be clear, I don't necessarily endorse or agree with T-Jump's statement about all academics think that theism is stupid or whatever. Yeah. I've always had Twitch, V. I've always had Twitch.
What do you do on Twitch?
Nothing.
Okay.
that he is the only possible justification or ground for those things. So that is the transcendental argument.
Mr. Jump, would you like to respond to that, or?
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify, so you're saying that all of the experts in all of those fields who wrote the books on literally all of those topics that you mentioned, they're all wrong. All of their worldviews, when the majority of which are atheist, non-religious people, they have some.
I mean, this is an equally, this isn't a very good argument, is it? Because it's not as if every single person who's ever written a book in academia thinks God doesn't exist.
Some logical contradiction in the world.
That's completely irrelevant to a formal argument. You're appealing to authority.
It's just a question. So no, it's not actually what I'm doing at all.
Well,
so
there are plenty of authority.
Stop, Jake. Let me finish the question.
There are plenty of authorities who share my view.
No, actually, there aren't. The consensus view is against everything you just said.
No,
so there might be a few.
I mean, well, you're going to arbitrarily limit which disciplines you
I'm going to take the majority.
I could give you a host of continental philosophers, analytical philosophers.
Jake, stop interrupting. So the consensus of experts, the vast majority.
There is no.
There is.
No, there isn't.
Yeah, there is.
It's total bullshit. You start the argument with bullshit.
Stop. There is a paper.
I wonder. I mean, like Tom came out like this pretty early. I wonder if he did this deliberately just to try and trigger Jay, basically, maybe to get views or something. I suppose that's possible.
That literally asked for the consensus on these topics. The field surveys paper where they did actually do this. Yes, that's a consensus.
It means nothing in a formal debate.
You said
he is right that in the field paper survey, the vast majority of philosophers are atheists, but there's still a sizable portion who are theists.
Your apologetic is a fallacy.
Why are you still interrupting? Stop. You said
because you're not even making arguments.
All right, let him. Hold on, Jay. Let him get in there. Let him get in there. I'll definitely give you all your time. Go ahead.
This sort of these sorts of debates sometimes make me think about I'm going to talk about I'm going to become a Christian for a second. C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, where there's like a theology club in hell, and all these people in hell are like arguing over the existence of God. And that's like where I think I've gone to that version of hell when I watch these sorts of videos.
Holy shit. So Jay said there was no consensus. I just proved him wrong on that. There's
A
literally
paper is not consensus.
Jay has his head up his ass. So a consensus is what the vast majority
Jay's right, and Tom just insulted him.
of the experts in the field agree on, and there is a paper that polls the vast majority of experts, and so they do agree on this. So there is a consensus. That is literally what consensus means. And all of the majority of people who wrote the books on every one of these topics he mentioned.
It wouldn't even matter if that's true. It's a fallacy.
Why are you
It wouldn't matter if it's true. It's a
No,
fallacy.
it's not
You
a
can't make
fallacy.
fallacies.
That's not a fallacy, Jay. What fallacy
It
is
is
that,
a
Jay?
fallacy. It's called appeal to consensus, appeal to authority.
Hey,
It's a
hey,
fallacy.
moron. Phil Survey's paper, just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Is appeal to consensus,
No,
appeal to
Jay, you
authority
have to
fallacy?
shut up and let me correct
Is it
you.
a fallacy?
Jay, no,
Is
it's
it
not
a
a fallacy.
fallacy?
No, it is not a fallacy.
Yes,
Let
it
me prove
is.
it to you.
It's a basic fallacy.
Jay,
Appeal to
Jay,
consensus,
Jay,
appeal
shut
to
up and let me
expert is
correct
a fallacy.
Jay, shut up and let me correct you. So Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, fallacies. Number 9, number 10. Number 9 is the appeal to authority. It is only a fallacy if it's a false authority. If it's not a false,
Frozen Sea, is there like what's the evidence for that claim? Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me considering his argument for like monogamy and stuff in mere Christianity. Like he seems pretty repressed, but yeah.
false authority is not a fallacy.
No,
Number 10.
And no cafe, I did not know that.
That's not the only
I
case.
just
That's
gave
not
you-
the only case. This is a formal argument.
No.
It's
Jay,
a formal
this
argument.
is a fact. It is not a fallacy.
No, it's not. It's not in a formal argument. You can't appeal to informal
Jay,
fallacy.
Can we just mute him so I can just complete my statement?
Go ahead, let
Shut up.
him get in because I can see that's going to be a point of contention. Let him get his full statement.
Wow, this guy is such a bad moderator. It's like he's not even paying attention to what's going on. Like Tom's just like insulting Jay, right? And it's not even really relevant. And then and there's some massive cough down the mic.
And then I'll let you respond, Jake.
So,
Go ahead.
Again, this is not a fallacy for anyone in philosophy. So obviously, Jay just doesn't.
Yes, it
ignorant
is.
of
This is so
philosophy.
stupid. This is based. You don't have
Why-
basic
can you
philosophy.
mute it?
This is
I-
one.
I can't. I mean, I don't mute people, but let him get in, Jay, because I mean, he's
He's
going
gotta shut up. He's just got his head up his ass. He's just ignorant of philosophy. Like literally,
Well,
go
You
to
don't have a
any
master's in
course.
philosophy. You have no philosophy training. You would
Clearly,
know that
I
that's
just proved you
a
have
fallacy in a
nothing.
formal argument.
You
You know what a
can't-
formal argument is.
You can't shut up at all.
You don't know
So
what a formal
All right,
argument is.
he's still, like,
It
you're
has
gonna have to
nothing to
mute
do
it.
with appeal to consensus
keep
or
doing
experts
this.
in a formal
The
argument. I made a
entire time,
formal
he's not
argument.
going to stop.
Did I
Like,
make
I
a
haven't
formal
been
argument?
able to finish a single sentence.
Did I
yet.
make a formal
So,
argument?
no, you didn't. You said you made.
Yes,
a
I
formal
did. I gave you a.
No, you didn't give any premises or conclusion.
All right, wait, we can't.
I
hold on.
absolutely did. I gave you pre-conditions.
It looks like Jay's actually got an argument written out on a whiteboard there, and I would love to see it.
So shut up,
And an
shut up,
argument.
Jay. Shut up,
Show
Jay.
the arguments that's out here.
By the way,
Still
show
haven't
that
gotten-
where your
argument.
face is. You have to say because the camera's really
So,
tight. Because
okay.
yeah.
Still haven't gotten to finish a single sentence yet. 'Cause
Zed is the mean. I wish I could see what it bloody says.
Jay has a head of his ass. So again, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or any academic
It doesn't
journal, or
matter.
any academic, why are you still interrupting, Jay?
Because you're not addressing the
What
argument.
did he say? Let him come on, Jay. Let him speak because we can't get past this opening part unless you let him speak. So I know I understand exactly what you're saying, and we'll let the audience decide that. But let him speak so we can get past it, get into it a little bit. You're speaking about that. We got it. The list that you're talking about here. Repeat what you said, and then let's go ahead and move past it though, so we can get past this.
So every single academic paper and academic
All right.
book in every single college shows that an appeal to authority is only fallacious if it's a false authority.
That's not the only
All
case.
right.
No,
Now
it's
let
not.
him. Let him.
No,
Jay,
it's not.
come on,
Literally
Jay.
the only case.
Come on.
That's literally the only.
Okay, so Tom's technically right here, but the way in which he's using that sentence is wrong. So he's right that appeal to relevant authority is not a fallacy, right? But appeal to irrelevant authority is a fallacy. And Tom's claim is that literally every academic is Tom's claim is that literally every academic doesn't need God or is an atheist or something like that. And then his evidence of that is the Phil Papers survey, where like something like 70% come out as atheists or something like that. So that just isn't true. And then, philosophy is also only one subject, right? It could be the case that there are physicists who are theists or geneticists, like whatever Francis Collins, that guy who's always kind of tried it out. Now, they're in the minority, perhaps, but it's still Tom's claim just isn't true, basically, and he can't go from this Phil Papers survey to saying that literally every academic is like it isn't relevant authority for his claim. And the Phil Papers survey is about people's personal opinions as well. It isn't necessarily about like you need some kind of meta-analysis of evidence in favor of a theistic hypothesis versus against it from the academic literature or something like that.
Okay, so
All right,
No,
all
it's
right.
not.
Okay, now let's go to the next.
The actual papers.
Go.
So that is it. You are just
The
ignorant. of
papers
law.
don't matter in a formal argument. You don't understand. You don't
The
understand what a
papers
formal
of the
argument is.
experts literally
It
saying
doesn't
what the
matter.
things don't matter.
No, it literally doesn't matter.
Jay, you don't know philosophy. You're ignorant.
I have a
of
master's of
philosophy.
philosophy.
Then
I have a
you
master's.
gotta
You
get
don't
your
know
money back.
philosophy. You don't know
know
what a
literally
formal
nothing.
argument is.
You just said
You realize
They're
that
literally just shouting, "You don't know philosophy" at each other, right?
if 99.9% of
Like,
philosophers
literally
disagree
you're
with a formal argument, it wouldn't
literally
matter.
you're ignorant.
It wouldn't
Literally
matter.
you're ignorant.
All right.
You
Like,
have
oh my
basic
God.
misconceptions.
Like you're so dumb. Like this is
All right.
literally.
You're not making an argument. This is the lowest IQ atheist debate I've ever. This guy's worse than Mark Brahman, dude.
I didn't even.
This guy makes Mark Brahman look
Can I
like
share screen? Hey, Ralph, can I share screen? Can I just show you
I
the
mean,
actual papers that literally
As
say
long
this?
as it's not
It doesn't
pornographic.
matter
Yeah, I
what
don't
the
care.
papers say. Do
Yeah,
you
I
not
don't care.
understand that appeal to authority in a formal
Okay, now what? Okay, let me ask
Doesn't
him.
matter.
All right, Jay. Let me ask him this. What about what he's saying though? That the papers don't matter. That what you're saying.
Right. So the first thing I would say is that there's no clear indication. Anybody who's spent time in the philosophy of science knows that there's no clear idea of what an expert is. So if he's just talking about the people who have degrees, no, there's not. This is a basic philosophic mistake. Have you had a philosophy of science class?
How do I share screen?
Who decides what an
It's
expert
just like a hangout. Like I haven't actually shared screens on here on this before. I don't think.
So
Oh,
look,
can you pull
Yeah,
it
go
up
ahead.
on your screen?
Possibly.
let me
send the
explain
link.
why this doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Okay, this is bad, and we only have limited time, so I'm going to look for one more thing. I'm just going to look for the transcendental argument and see if I can find it. Right. Okay, so he's got like a 2-hour. Oh, they're both 2 hours. Basic Transcendentals, J. Dyer, based highlights. Maybe I'll play this and we can see if we can make some sense of it. Because I still don't know what the argument is, really. I mean, I could probably guess.
Without soul, there's only darkness. If we are to believe there is a single cosmos, it must be that the cosmos is contained in some single soul. If there is a way of seeing things right, then there must be an intellect, and indeed that which contains and decrees right answers. But if there is no equivalent single soul, then the phenomenal world is always far astray. Our experience is always delusory and, by comparison, multiple and transient. If we are to believe not only that there are right answers, but that we can discover them, it must be possible for God himself, he says Zeus, he's speaking of the Greek view, to become incarnate, or for there to be someone somewhere who has the mind of God, and not just an ethereal abstract thing, but in his actual life within time and space. That's Christ. For Plotinus, the incarnation was the world soul herself in all reality, which is nonsense. At once our elder sister, Gnostic, and at the same time the fullest expression of soul herself. But maybe there has to be a more particularized embodiment, correct, and one that can be grasped from within this synthesis. That man is each man is a microcosm of the larger. And then he goes on to say that, well, we don't have this divine mind of ourselves. We get it through an incarnate God. So when you understand that, when you read my essay, and when you read the argument that Stephen Clark is making, then what we see is that it's not just a question of numbers, but all of these other things that you could list that are, you can call them transcendentals or categories or preconditions. We'll call them transcendental preconditions.
Transcendental or categories or preconditions. I'm not sure if those are the same things, but
we're just going to list some. And somebody asked the other day, is there a perfect list of all of them? No. How could there be? Let's just look at a few, and we start to see
that although on the surface this argument might seem really obscure, it's not. It's actually pretty. Man, these lights just don't work with this. Okay, so let's take the first one.
Right, so here's a list of things. Transcendentals, time and space, self, word/meaning, the past, universals, ethics. So is he saying these are all examples of transcendentals? And what does he mean by transcendental? So I think, I mean, like I'm assuming, for example, I'm assuming that transcendental means like a platonic form or something, or so, like some weird thing that has to like exist. Not something that I have to assume, because then it would be mind dependent, but like mind independent reality things. Now maybe someone understands this right and they're going to say no, these aren't mind independent things, he means mind dependent, in which case it might make more sense. But let's go one by one. Like time and space, that isn't transcendental, right? That's like the concrete world. That's like as concrete as it gets. Self, well, it seems like I could take a Humean view and say that the self is just like an aggregate, you know, it's like we're confusing similarity over time for identity, right? And it's actually just all of these particular things. Words/meaning. Words, I mean, like you could be a nominalist, right? Same for universals. I don't really know what he's getting at. Meaning, I mean, some people take the view that like meaningful thoughts are like, you know, like Plato's view is that they're eidos, the forms. That seems to be Frege's view. It's not Locke's view, so it's possible to take a different view. The past, is that a transcendental? Isn't that just my memory? Like in a subjective point of view, it's my memory, and in the world point of view, it's just like 4D space-time, right, in the past. I don't understand. I do not understand what he's saying, but let's see.
Time and space. Okay, now this is a transcendental category that you cannot.
Well, Alex Malpass just described time and space. Just described. So a priori is like before we come to any sense data, right? And a posteriori is after sense data. Analytic would be to say like in virtue of the words involved. So bachelors are unmarried men is just that's a priori, right? Whereas like all bachelors wear blue jeans, that's going to be synthetic. And then what Kant is interested in is there anything that's synthetic that can be known a priori, right? So the synthetic a priori, like you know, like here's an example of something like water is H2O, and then I suppose Kant's, I don't fully understand Kant. I've not really read Kant, but my understanding insofar as it goes is that like you can somehow prove that time and space have to exist as these categories in order to make sense of perception or something like that. I don't think that's what Jay's saying, but let's see. Let's let him speak.
Empirically verify, and don't give me the low IQ reply of, well, I have a watch. Your watch is not the same thing as time itself. Time itself is some kind of abstract category. Doesn't matter what you want to define it as. Point is that
like, is time an abstract? Like, couldn't time just be all the units of time in reality, like on a growing block? I don't understand what he means in abstract category.
It's not proven to exist merely by empirical investigation. Yes, I know it's a measurement. It's a measurement of the rate at which light travels or whatever.
But if the I don't know what he means here.
It doesn't matter. I don't care about how you define it. The point is that it's not defined or known merely by empirical investigation. But it's presupposed in the way humans interact in the world, right? We experience the world from beginning to middle to end. There's no human being on the face of the planet that experiences things in reverse, right? And we also experience and learn things within a spatial field, a visio-spatio-temporal field. That's how we learn things. There's not a human being on the planet who does it in a different way. We are beings constituted such that we learn things
in a spatio-temporal field of vision, right, in the here and the now. Well, how do you prove that empirically? You can't. It's an assumed transcendental precondition of knowledge and experience. The self, you cannot empirically demonstrate that you have a self. It's presupposed in all actions of cognition, communication, noetic energies, ratiocinations, etc. There's no test tube, no microscope is going to show you the self. That words have meaning and that they can convey meaning to other persons. It's another transcendental category. There's no empirical verification that you are transmitting the right meaning to another brain, another bunch of gray matter. It has to be assumed. The past. The past is a transcendental category that you cannot empirically prove exists or existed. It is assumed in the way that we as humans experience time and space and operate.
Oh, he means like you couldn't show, if you like adopted like Hume's position, you couldn't show that reality didn't just pop into existence with all my memories or something like that, I suppose.
Universals, right? There's no empirical verification for universal categories.
What I want to know is what philosophy teacher did this to him?
Invariant concepts, numbers, etc., but that we know they exist. Ethics, right?
Again, it's not we know that they exist. Like, this is like one of the most contested points in metaphysics. Do universals exist or not? And it's not even like all theists are agreed on this as well. You know, like William Ockham, right? Famous for his nominalism.
Is the ethics under the rock? Where in the microscope? Where in the test tube are the ethics? They are nowhere there. So they are assumed. These are just examples of things that are, and again, you can come up with more. But these are examples of transcendental preconditions for the possibility of even having knowledge at all in this world, and operating in this world.
I'd want to know how he's defining knowledge. Could I agree? I guess. So let me say, what do I think? Like necessary and sufficient conditions for there to be knowledge, what would they be? Okay, time and space. I guess I can agree to that. I'm just going to agree to that. Self. In some sense, I don't have to mean like an ontologically distinct substance, I suppose, from the space or whatever. But yeah, okay.
But these are examples of transcendental preconditions for the possibility of even having knowledge at all.
Yeah, time and space, self, words/meaning. Do you need words? No, I think you could have knowledge without being able to express it in sentences. Like you can know, like say ability knowledge. You can know how to ride a bike, or you can know how to eat a certain kind of food or something that's got a hard nut in the middle. Now that's a kind of knowledge. Propositional knowledge, maybe you do need to be able to express propositions as words. I mean, I'd say you at least need meaning, right? So maybe I can agree to that one. I don't think you'd need the past to be able to have knowledge. Like, there could just be like a sort of eternal present or something, right? And I think you could have knowledge. I don't think you'd need universals or ethics in order to have knowledge either. Yeah, I don't know.
In this world, and operating in this world. None of these things are proven or known by empirical investigation. Are they related to empirical investigation? Yeah.
Time and space isn't known by empirical investigation. I mean, again, I guess. I guess I just don't think that that's wholly true. Yeah, I just don't think that that's wholly true. Converse asks, what does Cratylus mean? The actual word, I'm not sure. I know what the dialogue is about. Something probably to do with language. I don't know. Let's Google it. Crat. Credulous. Word. Credulous is the name of a dialogue. Okay, it's not really telling me what the name means. Yeah, don't know what the name means, sorry. Anyway.
Yes, but they are presupposed in empirical investigation, and they are not the immediate subject of any empirical proof or investigation. So does that mean we cannot know these things or prove these things? No.
Oh, no, it was, we were talking about some language stuff about whether words are conventional or whether their meaning is sort of imposed on them, right? And that's the central issue in the Cratylus. So I think you were arguing for a kind of nominalism on something, and I was sort of arguing against it.
That's where the transcendental argument comes in, because it is an argument based on the denial of any of these things as leading to absurdity. So when we come to the question of God and God's existence and the mind of God and the mind of Christ, etc., that I just mentioned in the Stephen Clark paper that I cited in my paper, we can ask another question. How do these different things relate to one another? Because our experience of the world is not chopped up into only having spatio-temporal relations without a self, right? No, that would be nonsensical. Spatio-temporal experience assumes a self that's having the spatio-temporal experience. And when we speak or write words that have meaning to convey that meaning to another chunk of gray matter in somebody else's head, it assumes that they have a self. It assumes that these words and these meanings are entering into spatio-temporal relations to convey that meaning, becoming mediums for information being conveyed from one person to the next. What it is to be a self is partly bound up with the past. I'm not an abstract category. I'm not a platonic form. I'm not the number 7. I'm a person who has a past, a life that began at a point in time. Part of my past is partly what makes me up, and you and everybody else, right? So there's no neutral kind of, I don't know what it would even be, like some abstract neutral self that doesn't have experiences. That's impossible, right? Universals, universal categories, universal laws of logic, universal predicate in terms of predicates. These are presupposed in speaking. So the point is that when you just take a little sampling here of these kinds of things that are not like material things, and you say, well, these don't operate on their own. They all work together. Yeah, exactly. So how do they work together if there's not a God that holds them all together? That's the argument. Because what Platonism at least shows...
The argument is just the question.
And the Platonic,
I mean, he's still not shown how God holds all these things together.
Argument that Clark was interacting with, it can only go so far, and then it's terrible. It screws up at the key point, because they can point out some of these things, and then they say, "Oh, and the answer is just that it's all a number 1. It's all just the one, man." No, it's not. You need a mind, and the human mind is not enough to encapsulate and relate all of these things together in all of their different particulars in every different human being's life and existence. But if you believe in God the way that we speak about God,
yeah, go on.
That's exactly what he does.
Oh, it does.
He fulfills this precondition.
You say
he is
so.
the ultimate precondition for all the other preconditions. That's
what if I just said not God? Not God is the ultimate precondition for. How do you get all of these things with God? It just doesn't make any sense. Not God is the ultimate precondition. I mean, not the negative fact, not God, just must be the case. Otherwise, how can you instantiate any of these facts? I've tried my best over the past coming up to 2 hours now to listen as charitably as possible, and I've still not made any sense of J. Dyer's argument. So the best, as far as I've got, is that he thinks that every other single worldview is incoherent, right? And he's not really showed how. And he thinks that all of those things that he's got written on his whiteboard are these like agreed upon things he calls transcendentals. Well, not everyone agrees to them in the first place, and not everyone would account for them or explain them in the same way. and then he's calling them transcendentals, which doesn't even, I don't understand why he's calling them transcendentals. I don't know what it means. Like, where are they meant to exist? Or I just don't know. Not God is a non-term. No, it's a noun. It's a, what do you mean a non-term? Anyway, not God is a non-term. It's just a negative fact. It's like if I said there are no, the fact that there are no elephants in this room, right? That's a fact. The fact that there are no gods is just what you need for all of these things.
That's the argument.
That's the argument.
So I hope that's helpful. It does at first seem a little kind of abstract and whoa, that's weird. What? But I think when you understand it, it's like, oh wow, yeah. What else would it be? Nothing else even makes any sense. It's not God. I mean, it's not the human mind. The human mind can't do this stuff. No finite mind can do it. And the atheists can't even get past like why there's even needs to be a mind anyway. Because they don't even think they have a mind. As they sit there touting their own mental acumen, which they actually don't have. That's the great irony of that. But anyway. So I hope that's helpful for the transcendental argument question. Dalton, have you been sneaking out of Roadhouse? Have you been?
Honestly, I have no idea what I've just watched for 2 hours. I find it so weird that that Jay can know so many things about even just the number of names of philosophers that has in his head, right? He has to have a capacity for understanding information to have this many names stored in his working memory or whatever. But then the fact that it's just connected in such an incoherent way, the fact that someone like Alex Malpass can make such a clear presentation of disagreeing with him, and it's like he just can't understand, he can't directly answer or engage with any of the questions, even presenting his argument in a propositional logical form that makes sense. And I know in the T-jump debate, he sort of tried to on the whiteboard and I couldn't see it. Maybe he did it by that point. Honestly, I have no idea. I do not understand this argument for God at all so far. Maybe I'll keep trying, but I don't think that I've got any further over these 2 hours. So there we go. Yeah. I hope it's been entertaining at the least. I've actually found it psychologically painful to listen to. So yeah. Enjoy your evening. I feel like I've gone crazy. I'm going to need a bit of time to relax. Nathan doesn't get it. Needs more. I'm not sure if that's trolling, but I'm trying my best, right? I'm trying, it's not let's take a look at, I've got 3 books I'm reading in the other room, right? And then what have we got here? Oh, it's tied into, so, books that I'm reading, Contemporary Introduction to Analytic Philosophy, right? Is that going to be useful in my endeavors? Geometry and the Elements of Euclid, Joe Schmidt's Majesty of Reason, Augustine, Ethical Intuitionism by Michael Hume. Are these books going to be useful for me? These are books that I'm reading every single morning for 2 to 3 hours, and then after work, I don't know what more. Maybe I'm just an absolute idiot, and that's why I don't get it. That's seriously there seems to me to be 2 options here, right? Either Jay is just bullshitting his way through all of this, or he's a super genius and I just cannot even contend with anything that he's saying because he's they say there's a 30 IQ difference, right? If there's more than 30 IQ difference, then you can't communicate with each other. And maybe Jay is literally just higher IQ than Einstein and Mozart and so forth, and that I just can't communicate with him and whatever he's got to say. I don't know. Right. Bye.